So my name is Ana Constantinescu. I'm a PhD student in law at University College London, and I will be moderating this session today. We have three very interesting speakers with us, and the first one is Stephen Henry Hussey, candidate for Doctorate of Philosophy in Politics at University of Oxford. And Stephen is going to tell us today, why should theorists bother trying to discipline human rights practice?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to dive straight in. My background is as a political theorist, broadly working in the area of human rights and specifically on their foundations. So as far as the conference theme today, it's quite on the money. Political theorists struggle to deal with change and conflict. If the inevitable truths of life for Benjamin Franklin were death and taxes, the practical philosopher is kept up at night by these twin inevitabilities, change and conflict. As Raymond Geuss says, in modern societies, human interaction is not something that can ever be taken for granted. It is always potentially disrupted, unstable, and conflict-ridden. Human rights have changed and expanded drastically, and they continue to do so. This leaves us with a problem as theorists. As the content of human rights changes, does the nature of the concept also change? How seriously should we take the way rights are used and possibly misused in the real world? And should we be worried when some of the goods claimed in the name of human rights seem disloyal to traditional theories of human rights? In other words, should theorists bother to discipline human rights practice at all? I want to begin by outlining the way that human rights theory has traditionally been undertaken, which I'll call the orthodox theory of human rights. Orthodox theories have attempted to map out and fix a specific catalogue of human rights by invoking some ultimate value that human rights are designed to protect. Of course, there are all manner of competing claims for what establishes the ultimate value of human beings. For James Griffin, human rights are protections of value of personhood. For Cecile Faber, they're protections of autonomy. For Ronald Dworkin, human rights are about equal respect. For others, they invoke the value of human agency, a Kantian respect for persons, or human dignity. The orthodox view then commits itself to two philosophical positions, both of which are a hangover of natural rights thinking. Firstly, moral monism, the belief that there is a normative thread that connects all natural rights to a singular basic value. Second, descriptive naturalism, the idea that human rights are discovered by reason alone, operating on some very basic facts about human nature and society. The hope is that through abstract reflection we could identify some basic needs, nature, or capacities that would guide us in coming to an agreement on the epistemically correct set of human rights. The hope of this project is that human rights will enable us to generate a rational, neutral blueprint for any kind of legitimate political society. And once these universal certainties are locked in place, we can then get on with the business of doing politics. All of this, I think, is a fundamental error. What I want to argue in this paper is that we should give up the fight of constraining human rights practice. Not only is it impossible because of the limitations of human rights as a concept, but it is also undesirable if one seeks to illuminate anything about what human rights really are. Human rights straddle ethics and politics. What I intend to show is what Charles Bates called the normative breadth of this practice, by showing the range of emotional demands concealed within human rights. Within the practice of human rights, we see the rhetoric of prudence, expectations, and even utopian ideals. The language of human rights is invoked when activists march against their own governments to protest against torture, discrimination, or welfare cuts, when journalists and cartoonists defend their right or freedom to publish satirical work, when environmental groups attempt to reorient our priorities towards the preservation of the natural world, and even between governments themselves in justifying wars. So, as lousy as my Spanish is, we all speak the universal language of human rights now. Now, my argument is it doesn't illuminate anything to collect this disparate set of demands under some broad label of protections of personhood or dignity. What's more, there is little evidence that human rights can sit comfortably together in the way that orthodox theorists hope. As I will show, human rights cannot hope to just go on collecting new rights to add to a permanently fixed list. New rights open up more possibilities for conflict. They ask us to change our priorities. They ask us to pursue one good over another. To think that we can go on collecting new rights whilst the old ones remain the same is to fall prey to the worst kind of naive belief in teleological linear moral progress. So let's return to the orthodox theory. As has been stated, these theories rely heavily on the idea of shared basic needs to get their account of rights off the ground. Joel Feinberg sums up this view best when he says, "Natural needs are real claims, if only upon hypothetical future beings not yet in existence. I accept the principle that to have an unfulfilled human need is to have a kind of claim against the world, even if against no one in particular." End quote. Following this comes his argument, "Such claims, based on need alone, are permanent possibilities of rights, the natural seeds from which rights grow." This starting point, then, encourages us to see all human needs as potential rights in waiting. And so long as needs and human nature are static, which orthodox theorists contend, this implies that so long as we know these needs, the list of rights is A, predictable, and B, finite and fixed. Their point then should be obvious. Human rights can be determined without reference to politics. To illustrate this idea, Feinberg gives us the example of an impoverished child in a Mexican slum, who he tells us is hungry, sickly, and fatherless. He argues that even just the knowledge that such an infant exists should be enough for us to know that the child has a claim to be fed, even before we have any notion of who could carry out the correlative duty. Perhaps this is to avoid human rights becoming what God became for Ulysses, for James Joyce in Ulysses, the idea of a shout in the street. In other words, a claim without an agent responsible. Although the child's claims may not represent a full-blooded rights claim yet, we would still know that he has such a right in waiting. In this way, human rights are seen as a set of light bulbs that are already in their sockets from the beginning. As we progress in society and become more capable and developed, i.e. we're more able to provide education, access to food and health care, protection from poverty, these light bulbs are switched on and a dormant right becomes activated. This view is easily seductive when Feinberg employs an example that is so obviously linked to human suffering. But even so, is it correct to call this the permanent possibility of a right? Would it tell us anything useful about which future human rights we should pursue in our own societies? There are, for example, lots of needs which could potentially become rights. But whether they ever become more than a claim will depend on our own willingness to create the conditions in which such a right could be demanded. For example, we may think it worth working towards a world in which people live in a cleaner, more sustainable environment, or a world in which people have access to even better healthcare than they do now. Pioneering anti-aging scientists, for example, have argued for funding on the basis that future generations have rights to hugely extended lifespans that their research promises to provide. This is not so outlandish after all. If there's a right to a healthy life, why not a right to more of that healthy life? But do we really want to say that a right to universal healthcare was always lying dormant as a permanent claim upon the world 200 years ago? To retrospectively say this about a human right seems to suggest that its emergence was predictable. But rights claims like these are anything but obvious when they are first made. Many rights claims, as Bonnie Honig has noted, presuppose a world they seek to bring into being. That is, those advocating them embrace the paradox that they are claiming a right not because it already exists, but precisely in order to create a world in which such a right could be enjoyed in the future. So this view relies, this orthodox view relies on a false assumption of inevitable progress. It encourages a cosy view of past progress and a naive confidence in the future. What's more, we overplay the role of moral rationality and underplay the role of politics. The adoption of any new right or set of rights is at its heart a political act. It involves an act of persuasion. Each new good must muscle its way to the top of our preferences, sometimes at the cost of forcing us to prioritise its satisfaction over other previously prioritised goods. As Geoffrey Weeks argues, the claim for human rights is always in terms of some rights over others. They bring new concerns into focus, not concerns that are always underlying but had not yet been discovered. Many new rights seem initially disturbing or contradictory to our beliefs. For example, the proposed right to doctor-assisted suicide or the right to death might at first seem to shake us to the core. It might make us reconsider what is valuable about human life and its preservations, and what actions we can allow people to do to themselves. It forces us to re-evaluate the role of doctors in the Hippocratic Oath. It re-evaluates their role and purpose. We see the same kind of deep upset with proposed environmental rights. Consider rights to an unblighted environment, or rights to an unpolluted atmosphere, or rights to the preservation of a particular species. These rights cannot just be added to the current stock of rights as though they are a new benefit linked to some essential protection of human beings. In many ways, environmental rights seek precisely to upset the prevailing idea that humans are chief concern in our society. Although protections of the environment might come under the linguistic coating of a rights claim, this right actually asks brand new questions. Chiefly, how do we see our place in the world? Do we owe things to the world prior to human beings? The claim being made here is not merely a demand for inclusion, but a competitive claim against an existing paradigm. New rights, as Honig says, are not just new options to be exercised, like having more money in one's wallet. Imagine a lighthouse emitting a beam of light. Adding a new right doesn't simply widen our field of vision to include more within it. They ask us instead to turn the light around and draw our gaze towards something previously darkened. And the cost of that is we may have to darken things we previously had our focus on. So all this means that we need to engage more in the messy, complex political realm, because it's precisely here where human rights struggles take place. Even those rights that now seem to us to be most essential, protections against the worst kinds of torture, genocide, and the worst abuses of state cruelty, all come from what Isaiah Berlin would call the memory of horror, or the testimony of fear. From direct experience, we've learnt our answer to the question, how much are we willing to tolerate from government? But whilst this may have been the initial political question after the Second World War, the questions now being asked have changed. Human rights language and practice is not only used to resist government oppression, but to articulate our political expectations of governments, or to mobilise our support for more idealistic claims. For example, orthodox theorists see human rights as all asking a same basic question. What does it mean to treat a human being with dignity? This encourages a view of rights as merely born from basic duties of one individual to another. Again, a hangover from the natural rights tradition. But it's too singular a question and too basic to capture the array of emotive demands that encapsulate the modern human rights project. There are, for example, rights that represent questions about our expectations, with the right to meaningful work or holidays with pay. Instead of asking how to treat the individual with dignity, the right to education asks, what conditions do we need to create and maintain in order to ensure individuals can live a dignified life? Implicit in this newer idea of the state as an entity that not only has to be curbed, but also has responsibilities to provide the goods we expect of it. What's more, some rights ask even more aspirational questions to express higher ideals. For example, the environmental movement asks, what kind of world can we hope to provide for people? Or what kind of world do we want to live in? All of these questions possess what we might call a moral flavour, but they express different levels of emotional concern. If we want to see another example of these kinds of persuasive political rhetoric at work, we need to look no further than the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King's most famous speech began with, "I have a dream." Intriguingly utopian language for something that was demanded as essential, necessary, and an urgent appeal for inclusion. It evoked both sympathy and hope by addressing something urgent in the language of the ideal. Sometimes the appeal for human rights is not even best made on behalf of individuals, but rather on our shared ideas of responsibility. To poach again from Dr. King, he said, "Ultimately, a great nation is a compassionate nation. America has not met its obligations and its responsibilities to the poor." In this case, we see an appeal not to a shared humanity, but to our own expectations of the state and its function in creating a good society. These are not mere rhetorical flourishes. They represent a good argument for dissuading theorists from couching their ultimate theories of human rights as protections of a single individual value or answering one single unifying question. I think if we want to understand human rights, we have to come to terms with the normative breadth of the claims that are presented before us and understand that the practice allows for these different kinds of competing political concerns. Some theorists will balk at this, arguing that human rights become unintelligible as a concept if they represent such a disparate set of moral and emotional goods. But I believe this is because the focus has solely been on asking what goods human rights demand access to, instead of focusing on the kinds of demands that human rights make. Human rights serve three broad functions, that of defending, preserving, and prioritizing. Thus, human rights begin to mix three different layers: prudence, expectation, and hope. In this sense, human rights blend ideas of the right and the good. It has often been argued that the remit of human rights should only ever be minimalist, our most urgent shared interests, or protecting against what Baez calls the most standard threats. This is fine. One can argue for basic moral principles if one wishes to, but we cannot pretend this is logically entailed by a commitment to some abstract value such as personhood or dignity. For one thing, such a theory wouldn't offer a lower threshold for determining what things would count as merely valuable and what things would count as a right. Human rights language often vaguely refers to the idea of a moral minimum without ever articulating what that minimum is or why we should be concerned with finding it. In the absence of this, the practice of human rights will always show an array of goods fighting for urgency and priority. There is no arbitration device within human rights to keep out broader questions about political goods and priorities. So to finish, I think it should be clear that philosophical disciplining is a mistake on the part of theorists. Firstly, because by reducing all rights as embodying a basic value like dignity or personhood, fails to recognise the normative breadth of the practice before us. This normative breadth embodies a range of emotive reactions: fear, expectation, and hope. Secondly, because human rights are so often grounded in vague foundational values like dignity and personhood, they offer no threshold for distinguishing what is a value and what is a right. It's clear, for example, that even if all rights protect something valuable, it does not follow that everything that is valuable is a right. And finally, new rights force us to face up to inevitable conflict. New rights may disturb older, more established ones and force us to reconceive our political priorities. To think otherwise creates false illusions of stability and a naive faith in the moral progress of history, ignoring the struggle that goes into getting recognitions for human rights and the trade-offs made in their acceptance. There is nothing fixed or inevitable about the course of human rights. On this point, I leave the last word to Karl Popper. The future is not reached on steel tracks laid down from the past. Thank you.